Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining, making the trip over here to come to this session. Today, we're going to talk about how you can build custom content applications for Microsoft 365 using SharePoint Embedded. My name is Mark Wendell. I'm a longtime product manager at Microsoft, been working on OneDrive and SharePoint for a fair bit of time now. Now I'm working on SharePoint Embedded, and in particular, a bunch of different aspects of that product, but in particular in the developer experiences space. I'm joined by Farrelton. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Farrelton. I'm also a product manager on SharePoint team. Along with my colleague Mark, we are working to enhancing the SharePoint Embedded platform. So let's dive in today to see this super awesome platform and see cool demos.
Okay, I just want to actually, before we kind of get in, I want to get a pulse from you folks. How many of you have already kind of heard about SharePoint Embedded, know what it is? Okay, not too many. And then my second question is probably going to be an even smaller set. How many of you actually worked with SharePoint Embedded a little bit, followed us on our journey, and played with the APIs? Am I the only one in the room? No? Okay, my boss has as well. Awesome. Okay, well that's good, actually. That's why we're here. So here's what we're going to cover today. By the time you leave here today, our hope is that you'll know more about SharePoint Embedded than when you woke up this morning. So whether you haven't seen it before, which seems like most of you, or if you've been following along with our journey, either way, I think there's going to be some good content for you to learn about here, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. So we're going to cover this content in 4 sections. I'll give you an overview of the product, and then we'll do our best to kind of help you understand some of the core technical concepts. Then we'll get into some key platform features, and then we'll finish it off with some of the integrations that SharePoint Embedded can have with other Microsoft 365 in that broader ecosystem. Before we kind of get into talking about what SharePoint Embedded is and what it can do, I wanted to give you a bit of a step back a little bit and talk a little bit about why we built SharePoint Embedded, what problem we're solving. One of the things that we've learned from running Microsoft 365 and talking with our customers is that you all have a lot of content. And sometimes that content doesn't always get stored in the same place. And it all doesn't necessarily all get stored within Microsoft 365. And so, for a lot of you, much of your content is going to be within Microsoft 365, and we're seeing a huge amount of data on a daily basis and massive scale in SharePoint and OneDrive of your content. In the enterprise landscape, it's the case where there's potentially a lot of different applications that you folks are using, and those apps are storing content in different places. And so, for example, you might have, say, a legal application where there's case matters or something like that, where those cases, the documents stored involved those cases are not actually getting stored in Microsoft 365. They might be getting stored in some other solution. Or it could be, a mortgage app or what have you. At the end of the day, it creates, a fragmentation in your content landscape. And so having a fragmented content story across your different enterprise applications and your whole corpus of content within your organization creates a number of challenges. So if you think about this from a couple of different perspectives. So from the end user perspective, so somebody who's using these applications, they might get different experiences and capabilities when they're accessing that content depending on which app they're using. And so not every user or not every application is going to be able to deliver the world-class collaboration and co-authoring capabilities that you get with Office when your content is stored in Microsoft 365, or the simplified sharing and discoverability and searching capabilities that you get when your content is within OneDrive and SharePoint. So that in and of itself is one of the challenges. And then if you think about this from the IT admin or IT decision maker perspective, if you're responsible for administering a tenant that has all of these different applications and different places where that content is stored, it creates a number of challenges. In particular, in the security and compliance space. And so you have to be responsible for ensuring that all of those applications that your organization is using are able to meet the requirements that you have in the security and compliance space for your organization. And even if you can do that, the differences in how those address your security and compliance needs might create complexities in managing those business processes on its own. And now, finally, if you're a developer, so if you're somebody that's kind of making these applications, addressing those security, compliance, and usability challenges becomes your responsibility when you want to sell your applications or build applications for your customers. And ultimately, that's going to result in either shifting precious resources away from focusing on the core value proposition of your application so that you can actually, fill those gaps, or you're just going to miss out on that market opportunity. You're just not going to be able to have enough resources to implement whatever complicated security and compliance needs your customers might have, and you're not going to be able to sell to them. And then I'll say one final challenge. As all of us look to capitalize on the massive and transformational opportunity that AI presents, having your organization's knowledge stored away in different content systems makes it more difficult to unlock that knowledge and to be able to harness the power of AI on it. The opportunity that you have with SharePoint Embedded and what SharePoint Embedded looks to address is to deliver on this unified content platform. Now, it's not just about having a single platform and bringing that content together. The idea is that that platform is also built on Microsoft 365. And so you get all of the world-class capabilities that Microsoft 365 has to offer into your organization's custom applications. And if you're an app developer, it lets you have those capabilities built into your solution right out of the box as part of the platform. What is this SharePoint Embedded thing? Well, as its name kind of implies, it is a way for you to embed SharePoint capabilities into your custom platform. It is a consumptive set of APIs powered and available by Microsoft Graph. So it is headless, meaning there is no user experience with SharePoint Embedded. And you can kind of think about it like Azure Blob in some regards, in the sense that it's a set of APIs that lets you manage content and you pay for the consumption that you have. That being said, there is a massive set of differences in the capabilities that you get between having a file stored in Azure Blob or a file stored in SharePoint Embedded. And that's kind of what we're going to cover next. And because SharePoint Embedded content is built on Microsoft 365, you get all of the security, compliance, and business continuity capabilities built in by building your app on SharePoint Embedded. And finally, applications built on top of SharePoint Embedded are Copilot ready by default. And I'm going to show you what that looks like a little bit later. We've got a demo of that in action. When we talk about the world-class content capabilities within Microsoft 365, this is what we mean. At its core, there's a flexible content model or a flexible storage model that you get. And so the core content management capabilities that you'd expect when you're working with files, documents, and other content are available as part of the platform, including file versioning, support for metadata, having content types and recycle bin support, and more. And then also, when you build your custom applications on SharePoint Embedded, you get to provide the users of your apps all of the rich collaboration and co-authoring capabilities that Office has to offer right within your application. So that, again, is just part of the platform. And you also have the ability to take advantage of our extremely capable file previewer client that lets you preview PDFs, images, and more. Now, because this content, again, is stored on Microsoft 365, you get a whole bunch of the other capabilities of that storage layer, including automatic integration of workflow, Power Platform, Power BI, as well as all content that gets stored in SharePoint Embedded is automatically fed into the search index that is security trimmed and security aware, adheres to security policies, as well as the semantic index for AI processing. And on top of that, when a consumer of one of these SharePoint embedded applications is accessing that content can be applicable, like it is managed by the security and compliance policies of that organization. And so all of the capabilities that the consuming tenant admin would expect from Microsoft Purview are available to them when managing that content stored in your custom application. And then finally, SharePoint Embedded has a high degree of programmability, and so working with SharePoint Embedded, getting started with it, should be fast, easy, and familiar. Having the APIs available on Microsoft Graph, modern tooling that lets you get started quickly and easily, and an interaction model for the content that actually is the same as what you have with Microsoft Graph, Drive, and Drive Item interaction today. And we'll take a look at what that looks like in a moment. In terms of developing or picking a platform for where you're going to put your content when you're making a custom application, this is really what, again, just kind of further underscoring the point of all of the capabilities that are built into the platform. And on top of all that, we have just a massive number of engineers and a huge amount of effort that has gone into not only making these capabilities, but ensuring the performance, scale, reliability, and security of all of them. That's kind of it for part one. Now I want to get into some of the core technical concepts. And the idea here is that we'll give you a sense of some of the information architecture, how you can get started with SharePoint Embedded development, and more. Here's how SharePoint Embedded fits into the world. As you can see, it is a platform as a service that layers on top of the Microsoft 365 security and compliance stack on top of Microsoft 365 storage. Right? So you get a secure and compliant storage system that is built as a platform. Now you can build your custom applications on top of this, but it is not just for you. We are building on SharePoint Embedded as well. So if you've come across Microsoft Designer, Microsoft Loop, Edge Workspaces, all of those applications are built on top of SharePoint Embedded. So when you make, let's say, a workspace and a page within Loop, ultimately under the hood, that workspace is what is called a file storage container in SharePoint Embedded, and I'll show you what that looks like. And the page is just a file within that SharePoint Embedded container. The key takeaway there is that this isn't a new immature service, but rather it's built on the existing proven platform that we have, and it's built for M365 scale. Okay. So I want to take a step back and just kind of talk about storage architecture for a minute to kind of give you a mental model of how this stuff works. If you look at an M365 tenant today, there are already separate storage partitions within that customer. So we already have SharePoint and OneDrive that are kind of separate within that customer, and each of those content partitions is accessed and managed by the individual experiences of those applications. The innovation with SharePoint Embedded is the creation of a new storage partition within an M365 tenant called file storage containers, or just containers for short. And for those of you with a SharePoint background, you can kind of think about these storage containers like a document library in SharePoint. They're similar. They give you a place to put files, folders, and documents and things like that. But there are some important differences that we'll note. So, SharePoint embedded containers are stored in an M365 tenant, and they're a dedicated SharePoint partition for your custom application. Your app has full control of the experiences of creating and managing the content of the containers in that tenant. Okay? So when somebody wants to access a document or create a file, those experiences will be delivered through your custom application. And if you're making Let's say you're an ISV making a multi-tenant application. When you install your app on your customer's tenant, the containers that you create are going to be put into that tenant. They're going to be created inside your customer's tenant. Containers are also a scale unit and a security boundary. So what do I mean by that? Well, each container, so when you have one container, it can store up to 30 million files and folders within it, and up to 25 terabytes of content. So a container by itself can hold a lot of stuff. Now, when you install your app on a tenant, you can put many containers in that tenant. Up to 100,000 today, up to 100,000 of those containers per install on each tenant. So if you have a multi-tenant app installed on a bunch of tenants, each tenant can have up to 100,000 containers, and that's just the limit for today. And quite frankly, if you feel like you need more than that for your particular use case, come talk to us. Yeah. And then in terms of a security boundary, so I'll get into it a little bit later, but each container has a set of permissions constructs that you can take advantage of, where you can kind of specify who's allowed to access, the content in the container and what they can do. And we'll get to that in a minute, but if you think about, I do get a lot of questions when I'm first introducing folks to this topic of, hey, I've got this app that does XYZ. How do I map that to containers? What's the right scope? And the questions come around should I do folders for this or containers or lots, What I'll say is that it is a security boundary. And so it depends on the needs of the application, but you want to be able to take advantage of those built-in permission constructs that exist on a container. And it's not just a security boundary in terms of ACLing permissions. It's also a security boundary in terms of compliance and security management too. So that is kind of the unit where you can assign sensitivity labels and retention policies and more. And so that's something to think about when you're building your custom application. If you think if I was making an app that's helping an organization manage projects at the company, for example, I might create one container per project and assign project stakeholders to that. Or a probably more concrete example would be if it was a legal app where I manage, there's documents and a whole bunch of things that happen for every particular legal case. In that case, in that example, I might say every legal matter or case would be a container. I can assign the stakeholders to that container. But again, the information architecture of how your app's model maps to these containers depends on your app. And I'm happy to talk afterwards if you have any questions about that. Now, I did mention that containers, by default, your app controls all the experiences. So if anybody wants to access content in the container, it's available at your app and they have to come through your app. That is the default behavior. It is possible through app configuration, so you can turn on a setting at the level of your application to allow the content from your containers to be integrated into some of the other M365 experiences. In particular, discovering content, searching content, and stuff like that. And I've got some slides later on that will kind of dive into that in a bit more detail. Main takeaway here is that a tenant can have many SharePoint embedded applications installed on them. So in this example, this tenant has 3 SharePoint embedded apps. App 1 and 2 are kind of 3P externally developed apps, and app 3 is an in-house line of business application. Each of those apps is managing its own collection or set of containers. And you'll notice that by default, app 1 can only talk to its containers. App 2 can only talk to its containers. They can't talk to each other's containers. However, it is possible for multiple apps to talk to the same set of containers. Now, so in this example, app 2 is able to talk to app 1's containers because app 1 granted it permission to do so. Probably the most common example of this is if, as part of your broader solution, you have many applications. And so when I say app here, I also mean Azure Entra app registration. And so as part of your solution, you might have multiple applications like a mobile app or different web clients or things like that. And so it's possible for apps to share access on containers. And then this is really talking about the permission model at an application level. Now, if I'm making an app and I want to, say, sell it to a customer and have them install it. The key takeaway here is that I do not need to go ask that tenant admin for broad permission requests or broad permission grants. I can ask for instead this new permission scope. So I don't need to go ask for sites.readwrite.all or files.readwrite.all at the application scope, things that they're just going to say no to me for, right? Instead, with SharePoint Embedded, we have created this new permission scope and role called file storage container.selected. It's available on Microsoft Graph, and you can, and because it's a scope and role, you can use it for both app only and delegated authentication. And what it does, it's quite simple actually. What it does is it lets your app access and manage the content of containers in that tenant, but only those containers that belong to your application. So it's pretty straightforward. It gives you a storage partition almost, this is a way to think about it, in that tenant where you can create containers for your application and manage the content of those containers. Nothing more. So it does not give your app the ability to go muck around with OneDrive and SharePoint content or anything like that. Containers themselves, I kind of talked a little bit about it, like mapping in the project or legal matter example. Each container has 4 built-in permission roles, reader, writer, manager, and owner, that you can take advantage of. Set users' permissions on those roles accordingly to the needs of your application. And then you can kind of depend on the underlying access control mechanisms that are available in the platform to do your authorization checks. In those roles, you can assign both users and groups to them, which is pretty valuable. Another thing is that you can also assign external users in there. So in that example, if I was to go to like the legal matter example, maybe there are, that application is requiring users to kind of outside of the organization to be able to collaborate on stuff. You can actually permit external users to have access onto containers in your application. And then that external sharing is controllable on a per application basis. This is really important if there's admins out there. So if I want to enable, let's say we're going to demo kind of like an HR application, for example. If I wanted to enable external sharing just for that, I can. I do not have to open up external sharing on OneDrive or SharePoint in order to enable external sharing on a specific SharePoint embedded application. So that's pretty powerful. The real value here is you get a partition and you get to control access to that individual partition of content specifically. Okay, so I'm going to break out of the slides for a second and then I'm going to attempt to do a demo here. So this is going to be a little hands-on, a little technical. So if that's not it's not your favorite thing, apologies. But we're going to get our hands dirty here, and I'm hoping to be able to show you how you can get started quickly and easily with SharePoint Embedded. I've opened up VS Code. We have a Visual Studio Code extension for SharePoint Embedded. I just clicked on the extensions there, and I still have a typo, but it's showing up, which is great. So this is the Visual Studio Code extension that we've shipped. Right now it's in preview. I'm going to be demoing some stuff that's not yet available today. There are, you still have the ability to get started with this SharePoint Embedded Visual Studio Code extension, but as a heads up, if you download it today, it doesn't do everything that you want. Have no fear. Over the next month, we're going to be releasing an update, so be patient. This is the extension. I already have it installed. When you get it installed, you get this kind of icon on the left-hand side, and I've already signed into my developer tenant. With the extension installed, I can set up container types. Now, I didn't cover this whole concept in kind of the object model stuff that we were covering, but the short story here is that in order to get started with SharePoint Embedded development, you need an Azure Entra app registration, and you can use that registration to create a container type. And it's really just part of the definition of your app. Once you have a container type, then you can register that container type on any tenant that you want to use your application. It's effectively installing your SharePoint Embedded app on that tenant. Okay? So the pair of container type and Azure Entra app are really what makes a SharePoint Embedded app. And that's something that you can create called a container type, and then you can register that container type on different tenants that you want to have to be able to use your application. We support 2 types of those. One is a trial, which is a free way for you to get started. There's some limitations on it in terms of the number of containers, and you can only install it on the same tenant that you make the container type within. Or there's a paid container type. So I mentioned SharePoint Embedded is a pay-as-you-go service, and it's billed on a consumption basis. So the paid container type requires that you provide an Azure subscription so that billing can actually take place. And that's one more thing to note. When charge events happen and all of the billing-related activities for SharePoint Embedded, those are available through Azure Billing Portal. So you can kind of take advantage of all of, hopefully, the existing practices that you have within Azure to manage, your spending and costs associated with spinning up stuff there. And then you can also set budgets and all of that good stuff. So I am going to now create a trial container type. And I will make a new SharePoint Embedded application. So this is going to actually, under the hood, if the demo gods are with me, it's going to create a new app registration within Azure Entra. And then it's going to use that app registration to create a new free trial container type within SharePoint. And so then, like I said, I created a container type. Great. Now I need to register that on my local tenant. So that's the next thing I clicked. Now it is asking me, okay, in order to register that container type, we have to go get that permission that we just talked about. So now I have to go get the ability and ask my tenant admin, even though it's the same tenant, I have to go ask that tenant admin, can I please register this container type on there? So that's what I'm doing now. Okay, so I went through the admin consent flow. I got bounced back to the app. And this waiting for consent to propagate is just a sad and unfortunate reality of Azure Entra applications. Right after the consent, if you try to go get an access token and you look for the roles or scopes in there, too bad, they're not going to be there. And so I'm just kind of checking and waiting for that consent to actually propagate. This can take somewhere between 10 to 30 seconds. Hopefully, I don't have to ramble on too much while that happens on stage. Looks like I got that. And then there it goes. The container type is created, and I got that consent with the actual token, and I registered it on this tenant. So there we go. We have our very first kind of SharePoint Embedded application. Awesome. Here's the container type, and you can see it's indicated that it's a trial. These trial container types will expire after 30 days, and you can only have 5 containers within them, and each container can only have, I think, 200 megabytes of content. So you get a gig of content. You're not going to be able to build, your final solution on here, but this lets you kind of kick the tires and get started accessing the APIs, and that's what we're going to do here today. All right, so now that I've got this container type, I just want to show you some of the properties in here. So I right-click on that. You can copy. It has a container type ID. There's a subscription ID, which is effectively a nulled out one, and there's an owning tenant ID. I'll show you some of the properties here. You can see what they look like. So there's the name and everything like that. And then I told you a container type has an owning application. So this is an Azure app registration. A few things we can do here. I'm not going to be able to show you all of them today, but one of the things you can do is run the sample apps directly from the VS Code extension. And so we have a couple sample applications that are posted on GitHub that kind of show you like what a SharePoint Embedded application looks like in action. One of them is built in TypeScript and React and Azure Functions. The other is ASP.NET and C#. When you actually select one of these, it will actually clone it into your Visual Studio Code workspace, hydrate the configuration with all of the settings that you had from the container type and application that you created, and it'll be immediately runnable in your workspace, which is pretty handy. You don't have to do a whole bunch of setup. The other thing you can do is export it to a Postman collection so that you can browse the APIs, and that's what we're going to do. But the first thing I need to do for that is I need a client secret. So I'm going to create a new client secret on my Azure Entra app. I just did that. There it is. Awesome. Okay, so now I'm going to export this. So I'll copy the environment settings. If you haven't worked with Postman, some of this might look a little new and unfamiliar. That's okay. I'll show you what that looks like. So Postman is just a handy tool. It's got nothing to do with SharePoint Embedded. It's a handy tool for browsing APIs. SharePoint Embedded is an API, headless API service. So this is a great client for us to be able to kind of browse some of the APIs. That's what I want to do. There's two things we need to be able to kind of browse those SharePoint Embedded APIs with Postman. One is the environment file. That's really all the config of everything we just created, that container type and app. So that copied it to my clipboard automatically. I'll show you what that looks like. I have a container type ID. I have a client ID or Azure Entra App ID. A consuming tenant ID, that's the same tenant I created the container type with and where this container type is installed. And then a couple of secrets and some other things associated with the tenant. Then you can use, once you have this environment set up, you can use our SharePoint Embedded Postman collection. If you want to do that, you can import it directly from GitHub. So we just go to aka.ms/sbe-postman, and that will pull it directly from our GitHub. So you'll get the latest and greatest there. This is the SharePoint Embedded Postman collection. It's organized in two different folders. There's delegated and application, so that kind of lines up with the two different types of authentication models that are supported effectively with the Microsoft Graph APIs that are associated with SharePoint Embedded. Today we're going to go into the delegated folder, and to get started with this Postman collection, you just go into authorization, and all we're going to do is use the OAuth 2 flow to get an access token. Okay, so that was the flow here, and then in this example video, I did get an access token. So what I'm in here is the list containers API endpoint. You can see that's available on Microsoft Graph. And I also had an issue in this video, but it was getting access denied. It was actually just a Graph issue. So here when I requested the containers, so when I first, we just created that container type, it was an empty set of containers. So I'm basically asking all of the containers that are available. Notice that these APIs are on Microsoft Graph, and so they're on the beta endpoint right now, but we're going to be putting them over to the v10 endpoint shortly. There we created our first storage container, so when you do that, you provide a display name and a description. You can see I've created that container, and so now when I go get it, I'm going to hit the get endpoint. So this is the container object, and all of these APIs are available on Microsoft Graph now. There's a few different properties that I wanted to show you on this container. And so one is that permissions. And so this is where we would see those permission roles that I talked about for controlling access on the containers. And here we're going to do is create our first kind of permission assignment. So what I'm going to do is add a user to one of these permission roles on this container. So here I'm adding Megan Bowen. So I put Megan's alias in there, send it off. And once that completes, there was an access, I had a token issue in this particular example, but once that completes, you can see I've made Megan a reader on this container. So now Megan can read any piece of content that is in that container. I can go update that permission. So once I created that permission, I now have an ID, and I can update Megan's permission assignment to be a writer. So when I send that request, now Megan is actually a writer on the container, and she can write to any piece of content in that container. Now I'm just showing you here the ability to add a group. And so here I'm going to update the alias that I'm giving read permissions to be on retail. Anybody that's a member of the retail members group can now read content on that container. Containers have the ability to define metadata for the files and folders within them. So there's a whole bunch of properties. You can check them out in the Postman collection. But within a container, you can establish effectively a schema for the items that are within there. And here, so I'm making a column on there, like a text column called example. And so now any file or folder that I put into that container, I can set that example column, and we can use that for filtering and sorting and searching and things like that later. Another thing, so that's a way of defining a schema for the stuff that's in a container. You can also set metadata on the container itself through the custom properties endpoint. And so here I'm going to create 3 custom properties: URL path, tags, and department. You can set values in there. It's a key value store. One of the interesting things to note there, though, is that there's this is searchable flag. When you set those and you set is searchable to true, you can actually search for containers through the existing Microsoft Graph search endpoint using that metadata on the container. So now we got the container back. You can see all of those properties that we set. So that's kind of just giving you an idea of some of the attributes that are on that container object. A container, of course, like any entity within Graph, has an ID. And now this is the important part. I said earlier that working with SharePoint Embedded is familiar. If you take the ID of a container, that is actually the ID of a drive in Microsoft Graph. So you can grab a drive object from Microsoft Graph using the ID of a container. Let me just say it another way. A container is a drive in Microsoft Graph. So it's a very simple interaction model if you've worked with that before. If you've got a bunch of existing code that works with drives and drive items, that is just going to work once you have a SharePoint Embedded container. Here we're looking at some of the content within a container. And so you can see I'm uploading a file in there. And what I'm going to do is add this add slogans document. And once I do that, I'm going to set some metadata on it. I think I'm running out of time here, so I want to keep going. But the short story there is, and I'll skip over it, you can set those attributes. So I created that schema on that container. You can set the attributes on the file, and then you can filter and look for files within containers based on that metadata. So pretty powerful stuff. So that's how you get started with SharePoint Embedded using the Visual Studio Code extension. I'm going to go back into the slides now. We'll go into the third section of this talk a little bit about some of the key platform features that we've got. And then again, we've got some demos here. Farrellton's going to take us through some of these key features in the context of a sample application that we have. Okay, so applications that build on SharePoint Embedded can provide rich, full fidelity Office experiences for their users right out of the box. If your app stores Office files, your users can open, collaborate, and co-author on those files right from your application experiences. You also have the ability to configure how sharing works. And so I think here we're saying restricted or configurable sharing. There's a setting within SharePoint Embedded called restricted sharing that lets you effectively prevent resharing from happening. So by default, with SharePoint Embedded, if somebody shares a document, it effectively gives that user with either a link or explicit access write ability on that file. And by default, somebody with write access can reshare the file. If you turn on restricted sharing, it effectively lets you, through your application, control all of the sharing, so no resharing can happen. It's something that we've heard from our customers, that they want to be able to make sure that all of the sharing is controlled from within their app. So if you enable that setting, only those users that are part of the manager or owner roles of a container are able to update the sharing of a document. You also have the ability to control the app branding of how your content shows up within Office. As you can see here, when we're looking at the experience within Microsoft Word, you can actually have a custom app logo, and you can kind of control the breadcrumb path of how content looks within there. This is pretty important because not only does it let you, users, when they're discovering content that is exposed in your app, they get to, understand that it's coming from your application, but you can kind of set the path and context. So maybe it is a legal matter. You could name the path something that lets them know it's the particular case or something that matches your application model. Another capability that's built right into the platform is our rich file preview client. So with this client, you can embed a preview of over 300 different file types directly in your application. So if you have an app that manages PDFs, images, even 3D models or videos, you can embed a read-only preview of that directly in your app. And that can be done as an iframe within your web experience, or you can open up a new tab. It's a very capable file previewer. And as I mentioned, video is supported. And so you can actually put a plain video file into one of your SharePoint Embedded containers, like an MP4, for example, and instantiate a read-only view of that in the client, and automatically behind the scenes, that video will be transcoded and streamed through that client. So through that preview, you can stream video to your users. Okay. Switching gears for a minute, I want to talk about the perspective of the consuming tenant admin. So the person that's responsible for administering all of the applications within there and making sure that all of the containers and content within them are compliant. Several new capabilities that allow you to manage these containers within your consuming tenant. What you'll see here is this is the SharePoint Admin Center experience. Within there, there's a containers section and a couple of pages that let you manage containers. The short takeaway here is that as an admin, you could manage these SharePoint embedded containers just like you're managing sites today. So once you go into that new section, you can apply security and compliance policies like control access, apply sensitivity labels, update permissions of these containers. So that's very handy as a consuming tenant admin. You can make sure that your policies, your organizational policies are met. And then in order to access this new capability, we've introduced a new admin role called SharePoint Embedded Admin. And once somebody's added to that, then they can have access. Security and compliance integration. So by storing your app's content within your customer's M365 tenant, not only does it help you ensure that your content meets their multi-geo and data residency requirements, but you can also enable them to take advantage of the security and compliance capabilities that Purview offers. Security admins of tenants using SharePoint embedded applications can perform e-discovery queries and exports of that data. And they can also audit. They can, you can use like the audit logs in there, so they can look at accesses of files and updates and things like that are happening inside your application to their container content. You can also apply sensitivity labels and associated policies, and I think we'll take a look at that in a moment. And you can also, supports DLP, bring your own key, and more. So with that, I mentioned we've got a demo of this in action. I think I'll switch over. Are you on number one?
Yeah, number one.
Cool. So Ferelton's going to take us through a demo here.
Yeah, how are you feeling today? Okay, thank you for staying until now. We're 15 minutes. Okay, let's do a quick demo of this web app that we built on top of SharePoint Embedded. So Mark has been talking a lot about containers, APIs. So what does it look like in a real app? So today I'm going to play a role of hiring manager, and I'm trying to hire a perfect candidate on this app. So first, I need to create a job posting. So I'm going to hire a software engineer. So in the backend, it's actually spinning up a container right now. This container will be host all the relevant documents and content associated with this job post. And it takes some time to load right now. So here is what it looks like. You have a container created right here. So if I'm going to, in this container or job post, I'm going to create a job description in here. Sometimes the job description is boring, and I don't know how to write a good job descriptions. I will use a little bit human intelligence, which I can use a search, which is powered by SharePoint Embedded, that right here in the app allows me to search documents I want. For example, I can search, I will just search for job description to see if other people have written the same thing. So here, you can see a result written for my coworkers, and this looks great. It feels somebody do the work for me. So I'm just going to copy the whole document and paste in my own job description. And I have to pause and remind you, this is the Office Online experience. And this HR app is not a Microsoft first-party app or SharePoint app. It's just a random web app built by a third-party app developer called Mark Window. But one of the core propositions for SharePoint Embedded is the availability of the full size of Office experience. So you have the full feature, no matter it's editing, co-authoring, versioning, sharing, anything you name it. And also the most important thing is you can open this document in desktop version. That's what's matter, right? Then I can demo a little bit of sharing experience in here. Hope everyone's pretty familiar with. Okay. So if I'm trying to share this document with my manager, normally I'm just going to put her name in here and she will get notifications. But because the time is very constrained, I'm just going ahead and copy a link right here. And I'm going to switch over to a browser where I sign in as my manager's account. And I'm going to redeem the sharing link right here. So she can actually start to co-author on this experience. Again, run pretty regular Office experience. So she can edit, co-authoring, and she can put some comment right here. So I will just put a comment saying, okay, this looks great. Or you can add mention here for sure. So yeah, back to my window, I can see she is co-author right now, and she left the comments right here. Okay, this is great, and I'm going to publish this. Now, we want to take a look of some of our applicants or interview notes. I'm just going to an old job post and show you some of the applicant information. Again, all this documents is in that container we created for the job post. So now I'm going to see this resume for Alex Wilbur. This is a PDF, and it's open right here. Again, it's a built-in viewer supported by SharePoint Embedded. You can always open a video, which is powered by SharePoint Office Stream Services. We'll transcode and play the video back to you. And going back to our app, there's an interview notes. There's a Word document of this interview notes. And you can see there are some data about the hiring process, comments, hire, no hire decisions. So I want to make sure I have proper control of this document so it doesn't share with a random person. But we find it's pretty challenging for most of apps to manage permission when a user is outside the app. For example, right now I'm in Office. I'm not in the HR app anymore. So we have this restrictive sharing feature Mark mentioned earlier. So let me just show you. So because I'm a privileged user, so when I try to share this document, I'm able to share to anyone I have. But for anyone who doesn't have the sharing permissions, so I'm going to switch the browser to my colleague who doesn't have the shared browser. So when she tries to share, it will be a very friendly reminder saying, hey, sharing is limited on this file. You can only share it to people who already have access. So in this way, we can make sure no one bypassing the permission, even if they're outside the app in the Microsoft 365 environments. Or you think this is not enough? SharePoint still have this full compliance feature. One of them is sensitivity label. And you can always apply sensitivity label of any files right here in the Word documents. In here, I apply a highly confidential data. So this document won't be able to sharing, downloading, even print, according to any company's policies. Okay, we have accomplished quite a bit. The last step is to send out the offer letter. In the backend, actually, we're sharing a document with an external users. As Mark mentioned earlier, normally in SharePoint, you need to turn on external sharing for your whole tenant in order to make it work. But in SharePoint Embedded, it's turned on app basis. Basically, I can lock the SharePoint and OneDrive external sharing, but only turn on for this app only. That's a lot. Let's quickly move on to Admin Center. In Admin, if you're used to manage sites, we have very similar container panel on the left, which you can manage all your containers. This should be available in app as well, but there will be cases admin want direct control of any container. That's why we built this with the same look and feel with managing sites. But here you can see they're showing all containers, not only from Microsoft first-party app like Loop and Designers, but it also shows third-party apps. So if you build on top of SharePoint Embedded, your app data will automatically plug in this view. You don't need extra work. It's it will be here. An admin can come here, manage the lifecycle of each container, and you can delete the container, restore a container, and you can manage permission sensitivity labels on each container. It's all automatically available. So what about compliance and security? Again, full sets of compliance feature will be available for apps built on top of SharePoint Embedded. For example, in audit, I'll just show a quick example of how SharePoint Embedded result shows here. So you can see here is a search for audit. This is a SharePoint content, a SharePoint Embedded content, because there's content storage right here in the URL. And you can see all the activities related to this, all the information related to this activity, like time, who did the performance, who did what activities, container type ID. So everything you need to know in the Compliance Center. Again, so this will be automatically captured. No extra engineer work will be needed. All the e-discovery information protection labels will be available for any apps built on top of SharePoint Embedded. Okay, we have 3 minutes.
Thank you. All right. Where does the container live? Yeah, it makes sense. SharePoint Embedded is a headless set of APIs available on Graph. So those APIs that we're exploring, that's what SharePoint Embedded is, and of course the underlying platform there. And so in that custom example application, that's a web app, user decided to upload a resume or a file or something like that, use the Microsoft Graph API to put that file in there, actually just using the same API that I showed you with that add slogans document. So yeah, it is an experience that is built and managed with your application. I'm going to keep moving, and then we're going to stick around a little bit. We can chat because I know there's a lot to cover here. I'm going to kind of blast through, and we got one more demo. Fingers crossed that one works, and I don't need to go to the video. Really hoping that it goes. So, M365 integration for SharePoint Embedded. Really quickly here, the takeaway is by default, your content will not show up in M365 search discovery, like I was mentioning before. So if I search in OneDrive or SharePoint, you're not going to be able to see SharePoint Embedded content in there. However, there's a big switch that lets you turn that on, and you can enable that if you want to. There is native Fluid Framework support. Again, this is a bit techy, but Fluid Framework is a really cool kind of SDK and protocol that lets you build kind of awesome collaboration, multiplayer gamey type collaborative apps. What it does is it lets you have effectively a distributed data structure that will automatically synchronize across many simultaneously connected clients and store that state in the service. Key takeaway here, Microsoft Loop is using this exact pattern. Fluid Framework plus SharePoint Embedded on top. Okay, Microsoft Copilot. So by default, I mentioned that SharePoint Embedded content gets fed into the search index. It also gets fed into the semantic index. And that's what enables the ability to leverage Microsoft Copilot with SharePoint Embedded. And so what you can do is have a security trimmed semantic index of SharePoint Embedded content, and it's accessible via Microsoft Copilot. And I'm going to try my darndest to make a demo work here today. So what I'm in here is in Microsoft Copilot, and I am signed into a tenant. I obviously have a Copilot license, and I'm signed into a tenant that had that same Contoso HR app installed. So there's some job postings. So I'm going to ask Microsoft Copilot to summarize recent job postings. And here we get to see if we can actually make a demo work here. So these are just job descriptions that were fed into that app that was built on top of SharePoint Embedded. Now I can access it through here. We talked about enabling and disabling discovery. You can of course, opt out of this experience, but it is possible to enable this semantic index integration. And so there's a whole bunch of awesome Copilot stuff you can do. We're over time, but I can ask it to make interview questions. Or it's program manager job. And it should be, able to do that type of stuff. So pretty cool integration with Copilot. And again, when you do that, it is a very fast way to have your content accessible through Microsoft Copilot. Okay? There's some great interview questions for that job posting. That's everything that we have to cover today. If SharePoint Embedded is interesting to you or you want to learn more, I recommend you go to that link, ak.ms/startspe. That'll take you to our Getting Started documentation. It points to all that good stuff that I showed you today, like the VS Code extension, Postman collection, and a whole bunch more detailed concepts and stuff like that. So that's it for us. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate you coming and staying over.